The lone figure hiked along the old road, a backpack slung over one shoulder and a cloth bag in one hand. Behind him, smoke rose into the sky as the arena burned. The summer sun beat down on his neck as he trudged forward, but compared to the fire inside, it was nothing. Drake doggedly marched towards home, lost pistol and sword hanging from opposite hips. With a single-minded determination, he set his gaze towards the horizon. He had a message to deliver, one that would reach both friend and foe, one he repeated with each step. "I'm coming for you." Drake took another dogged step, shadow stretching out behind him as the sun began to set. However, the boy did not walk alone, because hell was coming with him. Hars. The sun crept into the sky as the Geknusian high priest pulled the whip back. The Clawval woman whimpering pitifully, back scored open from the brutal lashing. He sneered, letting his hand drop to his side. Reaching into a pouch at his belt, he withdrew a handful of white crystals. "By the authority invested in me by our glorious monarch divine, I consider your punishment administered." The priest screeched the last word with glee, throwing the handful of salt onto the whipped woman's wounds. She screamed in agony. The child clutched to her chest, crying out a human name. The high priest marched forward, picking up the little Clawval girl before gently inquiring, "Who the fuck are you screaming to, you little parasite?" The girl sniffled before bravely glaring at the high priest. "Drake is gonna win his fight, and then you'll have to leave us alone." The high priest just laughed and dropped the little girl, snarling, "None of you parasites ever win," before turning sharply and walking towards the town's church. Vim. Drake marched towards the town gates, glaring at the two Genosians posted outside. The sun was just starting to rise as the guards finally took notice of the lone human. They stepped into the road, blocking the gates. One leveled their Gauss rifle at Drake, shouting a question. "Where is your travel permit, parasite? You better have one or we—" The guards' words stuck in their throat as Drake lobbed the cloth sack in his hand at them. The bag hit the ground, and its contents rolled out of the untied opening, stopping a few feet from their boots. The guards looked down, their already cold blood turning frigid. The arena master's severed head stared up at them blankly as a deathly calm, emotionless voice reached their ears. "Look familiar? Perhaps a friend of yours?" The guards shook off their stupor 1 second too late. Drake moved like lightning, sprinting forward, hand closing around his sword near the crossguard. As soon as he was within 2 paces, he drew the sword, throwing a horizontal cut straight from the scabbard. The sword cleaved the right Geknosian's head clean off, making a shocked O of surprise as it flew. Keeping the momentum, Drake twisted at the waist and assumed a two-handed grip. Redirecting his sword's momentum, he brought it straight down in an axe-like overhead strike. The second Genosian guard crumpled. Head split open as Drake ripped his sword free with a growl. He stomped through the open gateway, eyes peeled for the guard patrols. He froze for a moment as an agonized scream filled the air. But not just any scream, a familiar one. Drake broke into a dead sprint as red mist clouded his vision. The familiar cobbled streets blurring as he ran. He rounded a corner and bowled through 2 unsuspecting Genosian guards who began to give chase. Turning another corner, Drake froze, watching as the high priest casually tossed the friendly Clawval girl to the ground. The priest turned, a sick grin on their face. Their eyes flicked towards Drake, and the high priest paused, a frown wrinkling their face. "That's an awfully threatening look for a parasite. Why don't I—" The 2 guards Drake had bumped into rounded the corner, panting. The high priest paused and then grinned. "Ah, yes, guards. Take this parasite to my home for experimentation. He seems nice and sturdy." Drake breathed heavily. The sound of screaming was filling his ears. The screams of 1 billion men, women, and children who were all killed for daring to live free. The screams of 1 million soldiers, giving their lives in defiance of an overwhelming force. The screams of 1,000 unwilling test subjects. The screams of the dozens who never stopped fighting. The scream of one timid little boy as the ropes snapped, taut around his parents' necks. A guard grabbed Drake by the shoulder and something inside of Drake snapped. Drake reached over his shoulder, grabbed the Geknosian by the forearm and tugged while bending forward. The Genosian screamed in surprise as he was thrown onto his back, the scream turning into one of terror as Drake lifted his boot. The scream was cut short as Drake stomped on the guard's head, which popped like a rotten grape, spewing gore onto the ground. Everyone but Drake had frozen in shock. The boy was dead silent as he slowly lifted his head to stare into the high priest's eyes, and in a calm tone, colder than absolute zero, stated, "I'm going to kill you all." Black ash fell from the sky as a small cottage burned. A very young boy screamed for his parents as they were forcibly dragged up the gallows steps in chains. The young boy beat his tiny fists against the power-armored guard that crushed him against their chest. The boy's shrieks echoed down the street as the high priest slipped the coarse nooses around his parents' necks. The high priest raised an arm to call for silence, opulent robe glittering in the light from the burning cottage. A gauntlet covered the boy's mouth, suppressing his screams as the high priest spoke with a haughty, superior tone. For the crime of slander against the monarchy, these parasites are sentenced to death. As high priest and lord of this town, I shall serve as their executioner. The high priest's clawed hand curled around the lever, and with a sick grin growing on his scaled, diamond-shaped face, yanked it down. The ropes went taut, and two souls made their final journey home. Drake stood, boots soaked in blood as he glared daggers at the high priest, who looked to have been caught completely off guard by the sudden brutality. Shock turned to fear as the high priest turned, shouting as he took off in the opposite direction. "Sound the alarm! Enemy at the town square!" Drake let go of the limp forearm he'd been holding onto with a snarl. Red clouded his vision, the screaming in his ears unrelenting as he broke into a sprint, chasing the high priest. Even in robes, the high priest could run, but he still barely outpaced the rage-fueled beast on his tail. A small squad of guards burst from a building, and the high priest ran towards them, pausing only to wildly gesture at the charging, sword-wielding human before continuing to run. Screams rose from behind him. Drake swept his sword upwards as he met the first guard at full tilt. The guard reeled back, screaming and clutching at the gushing stump where their arm used to be. The next three hardly took him much longer as he leapt forward into a headbutt aimed at the middle Getnosian. He felt their weaker bones shattering against his forehead as stars burst in front of his eyes. But he barely stumbled as he kept running, quickly regaining ground on the fleeing high priest. He ran with a single-minded determination, with a singular goal: to kill that goddamned high priest. The high priest rounded a bend in the street, bursting through a small wooden gate and coming to a stop as he tried to catch his breath, a wicked grin coming to his face as he could no longer contain his glee. He straightened as he heard that violent parasite burst through the gate and freeze. The high priest raised his arms in a grand, sweeping gesture to indicate the hundreds of town guards with Gauss rifles brought to bear on the blade-wielding ape. A few dozen soldiers decked out in power armor clomped towards the human as the high priest laughed with joy. "Oh, you foolish boy, I don't know how you escaped the arena, but you won't escape me. Though before I have my men kill you, who are you to single me out?" Drake stared at the high priest, rage and indignation twisting his face into a sneer as he shouted back, "You killed my parents!" He breathed heavily, sword gripped so tightly his knuckles turned white. Drake burned with rage as the high priest gave him a quizzical look. "Do you have the slightest idea how little that narrows it down?" Oh well, I tire of this charade. Killer, who in Rut's name are you?" The high priest glared at something behind Drake, and Drake couldn't help but see for himself. A little hunchbacked old man in a tattered beggar's cloak leaned on a gnarled old staff as he shuffled a few steps forward. Then, lifting the staff, placed it down a few inches ahead before shuffling forward again. A long gray beard with twin braids loomed into it adorned the old man's wrinkled, kindly face. Drake felt his rage cool as he looked at the man with sympathy, softly saying, "You don't want to be here, sir. I don't want you getting caught up in my mistakes." The high priest snarled at this and shouted, "Answer me, you parasite, before I have you both shot!" The old man slowly lifted his bald head, revealing a set of surprisingly sharp and clear chocolate-colored eyes. Coughing and clearing his throat, the old man leaned heavily on his staff as he finally responded, his voice touched by the signature rasp of old age. "My name is Cassius. I am naught but an old beggar, however. I remember what it was like to be free, to live without the oppressive thumb of tyranny ever pressing on your back. I wish to feel that freedom again, even if it is only for the moment before I pass." The old man lifted his gaze to the high priest's, cracking his own wicked grin that sent shivers down Drake's spine. "So I pulled some old toys of mine out of storage, to tip the scales in this young man's favor." The old man's walking stick clattered to the ground as his arms reached into the cloak, the old man's back straightening out as he began to laugh. Drake felt an overwhelming sense of dread and dropped to the floor. The high priest, sensing the same danger, dove out of the way as the old man's tattered rags were shredded. The old man cackled maniacally as the two arms, that were now obviously artificial, brandished a pair of GX-50 handguns. The old man's real arms racked the charging handle on a clacat belt-fed machine gun, belt of ammunition swaying as the old man brought it to bear on the surprised Geknosians. Cackling his challenge, the old man opened fire. "Come get a piece, you greedy sons of bitches!" Gunfire roared, ferrous steel and soft lead flying every direction as the high priest desperately crawled away from the slaughter, watching as his men fell to the ground with chunks taken out of them. The high priest scrambled past two charging guards as they were cut down. Spotting an open door, the high priest leapt inside, kicking the door shut with a sigh of relief as he was plunged into darkness. He briefly wondered where and how that old parasite had hidden such heavy weaponry and augmentations. The high priest screamed in shock and pain as the sword blade was slammed tip first into his leg, pinning him to the floor. Drake breathed laboredly, cheek torn open where a gauss slug had almost taken his head off. Drake giggled maliciously as he unshouldered his pack. "All that running, and yet here you sit, at my mercy." Drake mockingly imitated the high priest's grand way of speaking, as he reached under his pack's flap and pulled out a long length of stout rope he'd retrieved from the arena. "Your death shall serve as a message to the others. Be grateful that you won't be forgotten, parasite." The high priest watched in horror as the door opened, and instead of his men, that four-armed parasite grinned at them. "Why? Why me?" he whimpered. "You know why," Drake responded simply, looping the noose around the high priest's neck before making sure it was snug. "Sho." The town square watched as their tormentor was slowly hauled off the ground by their neck. The high priest jerked and squirmed as Drake heaved him higher and higher on the tree that so many helpless humans had swung from. Then, tying the end of the rope to a metal loop sticking from the cobbles, he straightened, staring out at the eyes of his fellow slaves. They did not return the look, their eyes fixed on the still struggling high priest. Then, a man, missing one hand, knelt down and retrieved a loose stone. Then, winding back, threw it at the struggling high priest. Like a switch had been flipped, rocks, rotten food, insults, and even a few gauss slugs were hurled at the slowly succumbing high priest. Drake looked on, a feeling rising in his chest, one he had never felt before. Utter satisfaction. Monarch Devin Aleostros watched the town of parasites through the lens of a satellite. His clawed fingers, encased in a tungsten war gauntlet, clacked against the arm of his throne. His advisor stood calmly at his side, observing the hollow screen with disdain. "Your Majesty, shall we use the satellite to make an example of these parasites?" The monarch stared pensively at the screen, reaching up and scratching his graying throat scales as he mulled over his advisor's words. The satellite had 13 gravity-driven kinetic projectiles on board. Just one would be enough to level the town, if he dropped it in the middle. But who would spread the word if there was no one left? Smiling softly, Monarch Devine adjusted the satellite to target the ground 1.5 kilometers away from the parasite's colony. He'd be relying on the shockwave to do most of the damage, but it would still be plenty lethal. "A wonderful idea, Advisor Knox. Let's see how rebellious they feel afterwards." Monarch Devine pressed a button on his throne's armrest and watched the satellite's video feed shudder before he deactivated the holoscreen. Glancing to his advisor, he cracked a malicious grin, shaking his head with pity. "Ah, these dirty little apes are so pathetic I almost feel bad for them. But alas, they bring this on themselves, didn't they?" Advisor Knox grinned softly and bowed deeply. "Correct as always, Your Majesty." "Huh?" Drake wiped the sweat from his brow, accepting a gourd filled with water from Gale, the little Clovel girl that was his neighbor. Uncapping it, he chugged back a healthy portion of the water, his dry throat aching with relief as he swallowed the cool essence of life. He smiled at Gale as he capped the gourd and handed it back to her. Drake settled his hands back on the plow, the grox hooked to it, grumbling in response as the got ready to pull. Drake watched as Gale began to run back towards the gate, heart swelling with happiness. For now, they were free. It had been a week since he'd strung the high priest from the tree at the town's center, and life had returned to normal, albeit without slave masters cracking their whips at them. Drake was just about to nudge the grox into action when he felt the ground start to rumble. Happiness turned to stone-cold dread as Drake let go of the plow, running after Gale as the rumbling grew more violent. He felt like he was moving through molasses as he shouted, helplessly reaching for her. "Gale, wait!" The little girl turned, face scrunched with confusion. The green-skinned little girl suddenly smiled, head crests flaring in her species' version of laughter. She lifted a hand, waving nonchalantly. Drake watched, as if in slow motion, as an invisible wave of destruction shattered the town's thin defensive wall and tore up the ground as it raced towards him. And then it all went black. Death stepped onto the rubble of the dead town. He cast his gaze up and down the street as he walked, bloodless heart heavy. Bodies were strewn about the rubble, human and Clauvel alike. Death paused, looking down at a pair of bodies. A human woman clutched a Clovial child to her chest in a futile attempt to shield them from the shockwave. Death continued walking after a moment, drawn to the glowing congregation of souls at the town's edge, but not before a tattered white sheet was laid over the woman and child. As he got closer, he realized the souls of the recently departed were guarding something. No, someone. Death stopped a few feet away from the congregation, gazing at the glowing image of an old man with a braided beard. The old man did not offer a word to the Grim Reaper as he stood at parade rest. Death just gazed through them, looking at the crumpled form at the center. The boy's shirt and pants were little more than bloody rags. Cuts and bruises covered his body, one arm bending the wrong way at the elbow. Half buried in rubble, Drake was a pitiful sight, but he still drew breath. Death nodded in understanding, bones creaking as he sighed. "Forgive me for being rude, but it is time for us to go. Your leader will live." Death watched, waiting for them to step forward, but they didn't, which didn't surprise him much. He could feel it in the air. Their will to continue on filled the air, so thick one could feel it in their bones. The Reaper sighed tiredly and finally asked his question. "There is something you want, something you think only I can provide. What, pray tell, is that?" Much to Death's surprise, it wasn't the old man who spoke, but a little Clauvel girl who weaved between the legs of the other souls to reach him. Bravely, she stepped forward, glaring at the scythe-wielding skeleton before her. "He fought them when we were all too afraid to. He offered his life instead of my father's for the arena. He gave us the gift of freedom, to do as we pleased without fear of the whip. Mr. Death, please, is there any way we can return the favor before we move on?" Death panned his gaze over the resolute, determined faces of the townsfolk. Both young and old stood firmly at his champion's side. He felt his cold heart beat and sighed, letting the mask of bones fall away as he set his hand on the little girl's shoulder, a weary smile coming to the teenaged face of Death. "I often forget what it means to be alive, to be human, if you'll forgive the euphemism. And yes, my child, there is a way you all may show your gratitude." Death raised his palm towards Drake's fallen form, and they all watched as it began to glow with a golden luster. Death spoke, voice echoing with power. "If you wish to lend him your strength, step forward and lend me your hand." Gale smiled up at the Reaper and touched his hand, fading away as she spoke. "Thank you." One by one, each of the townsfolk stepped forward to place their hand against Death's. One by one, they faded away with ghostly words of gratitude. By the end of it all, Death was left alone with Drake, palm glowing as he knelt and pressed it to the boy's chest. "May their strength be yours. Make their fighting spirit your own." Drake glowed a bright golden hue as the Reaper's voice boomed with the overflowing power. "And fight, my child, for what you and yours have been so cruelly denied."